I'm having weird problems with my screen adapter, so I think it's now recording. We'll find out. All right, so as Sasha said, I am from CAST, and I teach primarily technical physics, which, strangely enough, is not in the physics department. There's a whole story behind that, and I'm going to talk about student views of flipped physics classes and online physics. So this is just a little bit about me. This is when I worked in industry. I'm the only person standing actually in this picture. Everybody else is kneeling. I made radiation detectors for a company that was called Harshaw Chemical, which while I worked there, 7 years, 7 bosses, 4 names, 3 owners, 4 different offices in 2 different locations. I've been at the University of Akron since 1994, and I've had a joint appointment in this department for the end of my 2nd year. I actually have undergraduate and graduate degrees in master's degree in physics, and then my PhD is in physics education from the University of Akron. And unlike most people probably in my college, I've been, I guess, pretty active as far as research is concerned. And as Sasha already mentioned, I primarily do physics education research. I started off being a quantitative education researcher, which isn't too surprising for a physicist because we love math. And I did linear regression for my dissertation and factor analysis, which is amazingly similar to it's the same math basically as quantum mechanics. And doing validity and reliability estimates on something called the force and motion conceptual evaluation. And then I just kind of discovered something called Q methodology from a friend, and it ended up that the guy who created Q methodology was both a physicist and a psychologist. He actually got his PhD in physics, I think from Oxford, and then wanted to go into something called psychophysics, so the idea of bringing quantum mechanical ideas into psychology. And in a sense, he kind of did that with his creation of Q methodology. So the idea is that you use Q to investigate people's perspectives, so their views about something, and it's a mixture of qualitative and quantitative, and I'll kind of skip over that. And this is just a picture of me. This is from when I was president of the International Society for the Scientific Study of Subjectivity, which is the international Q methodology group, and we actually had a conference here in Akron in 2010, and I'm now a new position called advisor, and I've been reviewer and on the editorial board for the 2 Q journals that exist. So like I said, I'm going to talk about views of putting physics online. This is actually something that I presented in February at the Eastern Educational Research Association conference. And then I'm going to talk about students' views of flipping my physics classes, which is basically a presentation I did for the International Society for the Scientific Study of Subjectivity about 2 years ago. So the status of online university courses, back in 2012, there was a study by the National Center for Educational Statistics, and they found that about 25% of all college students had taken an online class. I found out through my study of how students feel about online that about 50% of my students had already taken an online class at some point. They're usually associated with for-profit universities, but for-profit universities enrollment has actually steadily been dropping the last 3 to 5 years. And so one of the things that we're seeing a lot more of, including at the University of Akron, is this idea of kind of embedding for-profit ideas or companies into public universities. And public university administrators see a lot of benefits to online, including the view that students like online classes because they're very flexible as far as scheduling, right? And that they have great potential for enrollment growth and, of course, money. So a little bit of background. So this study kind of emerged holistically, I guess. It all started because I walked into my first semester physics class, and it was about this time of year, and students were enrolling for the fall semester, and some of my students were unhappy because one of the courses that were in one of their engineering technology programs, was only going to be offered online. So we ended up having this conversation about how students felt about taking classes online. At the same time, there was only a couple of months since I had gotten a new dean here at the University of Akron, Todd Rickel, and he was already talking about putting our physics classes online. So this became a conversation amongst my first and second semester freshman physics students, and so it just seemed like, right, this was something to investigate, because when I looked, I didn't find anything where an investigator had asked students how they felt about having classes online. So my research question was, how do university students who are enrolled in a face-to-face engineering technology programs feel about taking courses online, especially courses that they perceive to be difficult, like physics? So a little bit about Q. Like I said, it's used to investigate views. It's usually a relatively small group. It's a mixed method, which means it's got qualitative and quantitative aspects. So there's a concourse of statements, and I'll kind of flash ahead. This is part of that concourse. So I started writing down the things that students told me. I started writing down things that my dean told me, things that administrators said just in print communications at the University of Akron. I'm on Scott Scarborough's book club, so I had opportunity to ask him some questions about online classes and how students might feel about them. And so I think I had 50 or 60 statements, and then I reduced them, but you can kind of get an idea of what those statements were. So things like instructors have higher expectations for students in traditional face-to-face classes than they do in the same course offered online, opposed to, say, an administrator kind of statement, which is online courses do not require, they didn't necessarily say a good instructor, but don't necessarily require a good instructor because they are online, or I would have an easier time finding time to complete an online class rather than traditional classes that meet on campus. So those would be some examples. And there was a bit of a mixture. So basically the statements are printed out and cut, so they're in little strips of paper that look kind of like this. And then there were 45 of them, and they start off, they read each statement and they put it in a pile. This is like my view, this is unlike my view, or neutral, I don't really feel one way or another. And then they slowly put each of those piles, they work them into this grid. So basically it's a continuum from most like my view about online classes to most unlike my view. And then they also answered some questions after they sorted about their choices for, right, the extreme ends, the 2 + 5 and the 2 - 5. I also asked them some questions about whether or not they had online class experience, and 60% of them had. And they also wrote some comments. So if they had taken a class online, they wrote some comments, and those were interesting. They were pretty much either the class they had taken online was, they were disappointed, they didn't feel like they learned that much, or it was really difficult because they felt rather isolated because they didn't have direct contact with the instructor and peers. So basically these students make Q sorts, you put it in software, and you factor analyze them, grouping them into groups of similar views. And in this study there were 3 groups that had similar views. So the first one, I named it Keeping It Real and Face-to-Face. This was the majority of the students, 23 students, and they totally rejected the idea of taking classes online. They didn't want to take classes online. It didn't matter what kind of classes. They just totally did not want to do that. Another factor was factor 2. This one was more open to taking online classes, but for them it depended a lot on the course and the instructor. Students wrote things like, if I knew who was teaching the class and I knew they were a good teacher, then I would consider taking that class online. But they were very focused on the teacher, right? So it has to be this right mix. They also, one of the things that they wrote, and which was also one of the statements, was they also thought that if they took classes online, they should be cheaper. And then factor 3's view was they were open to the idea of online, but they didn't want any science, technology, engineering, or math classes online. So this was the smallest group. There were only 4 students. They thought it was okay if it was a humanities type class. A student actually talked about taking some classes online at Kent State and how they were more writing based, and he felt that that was okay because he could learn that material on his own. But he was a good student, but he really questioned some of the other aspects of learning. These students were not particularly interested in the social aspects of the classroom, but the other 2 views were very interested. They wanted to work with peers. They also enjoyed interacting with students, not necessarily for learning, but just for their own social aspects. So here's an example of what a student who was on Factor 1, Keeping It Real and Face-to-Face, said. My previous online course was a decent course, not horrible, but not great. I feel that the traditional classroom setting is a richer learning experience than online classes because in a classroom setting, there is interaction and collaboration between peers and instructors, which I believe is a crucial part of learning. Simply, learning to me is more effective in a classroom setting. Here are a couple comments from the students who said that it depends on the course and the teacher. One student wrote, a good teacher is required regardless of the teaching medium. Another student wrote how he liked being in class, interacting with people and talking to people outside of class. I like to work in groups to make sure we all are understanding the material. All my classes are flipped and we do a lot of group work. And then another student wrote, I think it would be a bad idea if all classes were online. If the professor isn't that good, then the course is going to be tough and students wouldn't learn that much. Some online courses are all right depending on the course and the instructor. And then one of the people who said that they would consider taking online classes but not science and math wrote, engineering, physics, or any STEM degree online will deter students and fail miserably. It's like teaching a mechanic to build an engine with a blindfold on. And then Q methodology not only helps you discern the different views, but it also helps you determine consensus, so agreement amongst the views. And there were 8 statements that there was agreement about. And it was interesting because 4 of those, half of the consensus statements, were the statements that came from administrators. So students agreed that simulated laboratories are not as effective as those using real laboratory equipment. I will tell you that one of the statement, number 12 and 21 that were about simulated labs actually came from an administrator that said that they were just as good. Statement 34, students feel they learn best with hands-on activities in the laboratory and classroom. So they really, and this is not uncommon, my students often tell me that they learn best in groups, they learn best hands-on, They're not necessarily the students who are good at playing school. They also express concern, the difference between interacting with an instructor in an online class compared to interacting with an instructor face-to-face. They really prefer face-to-face interactions. And then there were a number of students who wrote comments and also one of the consensus statements about how future employers would perceive a student who took online classes or completed a program partially or completely online. I'll point out that transcripts from students don't differentiate if they took a class online or if they took it face-to-face, at least not at the University of Akron. So, but they were still, we had talked about that, but they were still very concerned about that. So some conclusions from this particular study, there's 3 different students of online classrooms. I wouldn't say that any of them are particularly glowing about online. They seem to be very out of sync with how administrators think students feel about online classes. For instance, number 43, I had 2 people who are administrators tell me how students love technology, but they really are a little more neutral about technology. And I love this quote from one of the students. He wrote, just because our generation likes our phones and computers, that doesn't mean we want to take classes on them. So it seems like the next thing I should really do is try to get maybe my dean or Scott Scarborough or some other administrators to sort these same statements, maybe sort based on how they view them and maybe how they think students view the statements, what their perception is, and that might actually show a greater difference between how students perceive online classes and administrators. It could be enlightening for administrators. I'm not really sure. The link at the bottom is actually, I only tested the first semester of physics first when I did this study, and I wrote it up. It was actually it's already up on the Journal of Science and Technology, JOST. It's a Springer journal. It was actually the fastest turnaround I've ever had for a journal article. It was up, I submitted it was accepted like 2 weeks later, and it was available online, I think 6 weeks later. So, and it just so happened that the day I presented this study at EERA, an article came out in Inside Higher Education, and it was a very large survey of how high school students think about online classes. And you notice that 48% say none of their classes, they don't want to have any of their college classes online, right? 37% say a few of my classes, right? And then it kind of breaks down from there. It's really not that different from my findings, right? So the idea that students are kind of digital natives who want to take classes online, right, might be a myth. Okay, questions about the first part of the study, and then I'll...
I have a couple.
Sure.
What does Q stand for?
It's funny. Q, sometimes people think the Q stands for quantum, but it actually doesn't. For factor analysis, there's different letters. There's R for, it groups items in a test, so like in a survey. And then there's some other letters. I don't know, there's O and P, but I don't remember what they stand for anymore. And so Q is just a letter that they picked somewhere along the line about grouping people. So it doesn't really stand for anything. It just kind of ended up being Q.
Now, second question is about the students who took the survey. Were they selected somehow?
Oh, for my Q study, they were all of my students who were enrolled in the first and second semester of physics. So I can't remember. I think there were 45 students, something like that.
You said about half of them had taken online courses?
A little more than half had taken online classes.
Based on those students who took the online courses before, or only over the whole?
It was everybody. It was interesting because of the 3 views, it wasn't like one of the views was only populated by people who had taken an online class. Each one was a mixture of people who hadn't taken an online class and students who had taken online classes. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
60% of them had taken online.
They had taken an online class.
Those who took online, did they show any favoritism to want to take it again compared to those who hadn't taken it?
They had a pretty negative view of their online class experiences, unless this is going to sound bad, but if it was a class that they didn't feel was particularly important for them, so maybe like a human relations class or something that they didn't feel like directly impacted their major, they had a little seemingly different attitude towards it. I know that 2 of my students had said kind of nice things. We have some of our tech math is online, and so I had 2 students who specifically said that they didn't mind taking tech math 2 and 3 online. But I know who they are, and I know that they just didn't do well on the math placement test. They should have been in a higher class. So for them, tech math 2 and 3 were more review rather than learning the material, and I think that might have had could have had some kind of impact on how they felt about that class. Yes, sir.
I have 2 questions. One of them is for page 7 in the slides. In the table, you have number 5. It should be 9.
Oh, 9? That one? Okay.
Number 5? Are you sure about these online courses do not require? There are a bunch of MIT online courses, and they're famous for a good, awesome features.
Right. Oh no, that was something that basically an administrator told me.
These are the statements.
Yeah,
students were asked to evaluate.
Right. So they're not true or false. It's just how they felt about them.
Oh.
So and yeah, they were like you. They felt like they had to be a good instructor. An administrator told me that, basically once you make an online class, it doesn't matter. Once that person has made this kind of packaged online class, you don't have to necessarily have an expert come in and teach that class again. So that's where that statement came from.
I also have another question. You had a slide that had 3 parts. About 23 students, they don't like to take online courses.
Oh yeah. Right.
Do you have any information about their GPA? Maybe students who work hard wants to take online courses because they read courses. Maybe, I mean, there are some courses we have 100 students in one class, and half of the class is sleeping.
Right.
Definitely, they don't want to take online courses because they have to take a sit and study. So maybe it's one of the reasons that majority of the students doesn't like online courses. It's just an idea.
It was a mixture. Probably about half of those students had had an online class before. It's funny. So one of the students who I think he ended up, he must be on he was on factor 3. The best student in the class is on factor 3. He's very smart. He is not social. He was not a social student in any respect. He was the only person who wrote, I could be successful in an online class. The only one. And he could be, because he didn't need to talk to peers. He wanted to do group work by himself. He's kind of antisocial.
Really smart students probably succeed no matter what you do to them, right?
He's probably high-functioning Asperger's, truthfully, and he is. And so yeah, he would much rather work by himself. To him, it didn't matter if it was online because he'd figure it out, and he probably would. And this is that's one of the things that we've talked about in President's Book Club, which is the idea that the really smart, motivated students, it doesn't matter, right, so much what the learning environment is for them. They could be online, they could be anywhere. They're going to figure it out. But that's not who we teach to, right? We try to teach to everybody, and we try to bring everybody to the table. So if we're only aiming towards the best students, if you got a perfect score on the ACT and you're graduating from Hudson High School at the top 3 in your class, you're probably going to Harvard or someplace else, and you're probably not going to take classes online. Did I answer your question in a kind of roundabout way?
This was not an anonymous survey.
It was anonymous, but I could figure out who students were just from what they wrote, just because my classes are relatively small, probably compared to yours. So my first semester class maxes out at 25, and my second semester is at 30. So, and I teach lab, so I usually get to know students pretty well. So I could figure out pretty easily who was what. And I asked them some questions about their major and some other things, and none of those things were tied to where they ended up. So, yes, sir.
Was there any? So I'm curious about like the year of the students, or maybe the age of the students who took your survey, because I mean, sometimes you get, like I've said I've taken computer online courses myself, and I mean, personally, I didn't enjoy it, but I know several other people who were of my same peer group that didn't have it, and some other students who were in the same class that were, maybe a year ahead of me, a more experienced student.
Right. Most of my students are technically freshmen or sophomores. These 2 classes were predominantly traditional students. There were a couple of students who were older. So the older student, who was kind of not very social, he was on factor 3. He was the oldest person who participated in the study. So, yeah. So, and some of your questions about GPA and some other things kind of tie into the next part, which is talking about my flipped classroom. So I actually presented this 2 years ago, and I've evaluated my flipped physics classes for a couple of semesters, and this is the second part of that